Many thanks, Joel, and many thanks to AIJAC. Can you hear me? Good. No? No, I will speak up. I will speak up. So first of all, many thanks, Joel. Many thanks to AIJAC. At this time of ludicrous oversimplification, rampant misinformation, and toxic bias, it's hard to think of an organization that is more important than AIJAC. Yes, there are plenty of people whom one cannot convince, but no one, however, should have the excuse that they weren't told the facts. Years ago, Saul Bellow published a marvelous book of essays called "There is Simply Too Much to Think About." Who among us has not felt, in the 17 months since October 7th, overwhelmed by events that until then we would scarcely have credited, much less predicted? There is indeed simply too much to think about. But think about it we must, not merely so as to understand, but so as to respond. With your permission, I will therefore sketch, by way of introduction, some preliminary elements, and there are no more than that, of an analysis. It is, as ever, useful to start from the obvious, and few things are more obvious than the role that significant elements in the Muslim community have played in the current wave of anti-Semitism. That Muslims in Australia are entitled to hold and express strong views about the Middle East scarcely needs to be said. But it is one thing to hold strong views, and quite another to insult, intimidate, and injure others, much less to call Jews, including presumably Australian Jews, vermin that deserves to be exterminated. It is important to try to place those developments and those facts in historical context. This much immediately emerges when one views them in that perspective, that it is hard, if not impossible, to find any precedent in this country's history for that kind of behavior, at least on the current scale. Australia has, in the past, experienced periods scarred by intense ethnic and religious antagonisms. The tensions between the Irish and the English in the decades leading up to the Irish Civil War are a striking case in point. But while those tensions imposed large and durable costs, they were reasonably well contained and only infrequently boiled over into outright clashes. Thus, in her historical survey of religious conflict in the countries of British settlement, Hilary Carey concludes that 19th century Australians, quote, lived in a sectarian environment. However, the sectarian tensions always remained a pale imitation of rival tensions in Northern England, Ireland, and Scotland, or in any other settler society. That favorable assessment scarcely remains true today. The reason for the difference between then and now is, I believe, simple. The pressures that made for integration and toleration were far stronger in the past, while those that made for separation and intolerance were far weaker. Sheer distance was an especially potent source of the pressures to integrate. To come to Australia was to leave one's home country and even one's home culture behind, usually forever. The past was literally another country. Moreover, in Australia, there was no choice but to mix with people who were radically different. As John Hirst, late great historian, Australian historian, noted, what most shocked many English settlers when they came to this country was not the climate, the natural environment, or even the indigenous inhabitants. It was the fact of having to live and work alongside Irishmen, Welshmen, and Scots. Together with the distance, that fact imposed a profound change in lifestyles and attitudes. Even the most devout Irish Catholics soon discovered that one could not live in Melbourne as if one were still in County Cork. There were, at the same time, strong and effective integrative institutions. No one has placed greater emphasis or done better research on the role of those institutions, and notably of the labour movement, than Patrick O'Farrell, the great historian of Irish Catholicism in Australia. The ALP and the unions, O'Farrell writes, were, quote unquote, the most powerful of anti-Irish solvents. They joined persons of all religions or none in common cause, with their mass membership broadening Irish Catholic acquaintance and friendship outside their religion. And on top of all that, while the movement had factions and conflicting tendencies, it would not entertain sectarianism, unquote. Reinforcing the integrative effect of those movements was a dense mesh of community organizations, such as sporting clubs, which, John Hirst has shown, made it a rule to ensure that their leadership and membership spanned and hence brought together different religious and ethnic communities. But if those integrative mechanisms worked, it was also because the differences were smaller and less virulent. Not even Cardinal Mannix, taken in his most extreme moments, ever suggested that non-Catholics were vermin. One simply cannot imagine him entertaining the thought that Protestants should be eliminated. Rather, the dominant attitude among Irish Catholics in this country, an attitude greatly reinforced by pride in what they and Australia had achieved, was a deep sense of common Australianness. We shall champion the claims of Irish Australians to perfect, essential equality with their fellow citizens, the Irish Australian proudly declared in its first editorial in 1894, but we shall advocate it on generous lines, offering a hearty welcome to all those who would become Australian. To say Australians warmed to others would be an exaggeration. But there was, at least for those classed as whites and who played by the rules, an acceptance that was often grudging, but nonetheless real. In the end, says O'Farrell, quote, with the wish to belong together far stronger than any impulse to grow apart, sectarianism came to be regarded as profoundly un-Australian. The contrast to the present could not be starker. As anyone who has set foot in Lakemba knows, it is, thanks partly to the miracles of modern communication, now entirely possible to live in separate communities, completely immersed in one's culture of origin and hostile to the culture of the country in which one has chosen to actually live. Indeed, the rhetoric of multiculturalism, which makes ethnicity into destiny, does not merely define that separatism as a right. All too often, it has hailed it as a virtue. Meanwhile, the integrative institutions on which O'Farrell so rightly focused have virtually disappeared. Membership in broadly based organizations has withered. As mass membership movements, they are practically defunct. So has the phenomenon the great German sociologist Georg Simmel called sociation, in which individuals, by participating in a range of distinct groups, each with a different membership, continuously experience diversity and learn how to live together. The issue is not that people are, to use the Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam's phrase, bowling alone. It is that, particularly as they congregate in social media's echo chambers, they bowl only with others who are no different from themselves. To make things worse, the integrative force of national pride in this country and in its achievements, along with a genuine shared bond of common nationhood, has also weakened, perhaps to the point of near extinction. It has instead become entirely acceptable to view Australia as a project that is reprehensible at best, genocidal at worst, forever scarred in any event by the defects of its birth. Turning against that project is no longer to be dismissed as un-Australian. It is, on the contrary, to be on the right side of history. Those trends affect, or one might properly say afflict, our society as a whole. The problems they create are, however, especially strong in respect of parts of Australia's Muslim communities. To say that is not to tar everyone with the same brush. Like its global counterpart, there are significant differences related to country of origin and to conflicting beliefs within those communities. But there are also commonalities and, more recently, common trends. Those commonalities are, at least to some extent, inherent in the corpus of doctrine. Two facts stand out, each, in my view, undeniable. The first is the stress Islamic doctrine places on the inherent value of warfare against, or more generally, deep suspicion of and antagonism to other faiths. As Michael Cook, the professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, recently wrote, quote, "An unambiguous endorsement of warfare against outsiders is not just older in Islam and more firmly built into its tradition than it appears to be in the other major faiths, it also bulks larger. Moreover, unlike the other major faiths, quote, this heritage did not fall into oblivion with the passing of the centuries. On the contrary, for a whole complex of reasons, it has remained vivid and has retained its authority into modern times," unquote. The forms it now takes are very varied, going from the extreme separatism preached by powerful movements such as the Tablighi through to outright jihadism. But its reach and impact are pervasive. The second fact is the prominence and increasing centrality in that generalized hostility to other faiths of anti-Semitism. The vituperative references to Jews in the Quran and the Hadith are well known. But what really distinguishes Islam from Catholicism, which also has a long, sorry tradition of Judeophobia, is that Islam has never had its Vatican II moment. Indeed, two of the greatest historians of Vatican II, Piero Doria and Philippe Chenot, who both served as the most senior Vatican archivists, have recently documented the intense opposition of Muslim leaders to Nostra Aetate, the papal encyclical, or part of the papal encyclical that cleansed the Jews of the responsibility or guilt for the death of Christ. Nor could anyone deny that the blatantly exterminationist, openly apocalyptic version of Islamic anti-Semitism has gained ever greater strength over time. In short, there is, in parts at least of Australia's Muslim communities, a deep well of hatred, more extreme than any of its predecessors and less diminished by the integrative pressures that previously tamed ethnic and religious animosities in this country and kept them firmly under control. It burst onto our public spaces after October 7th. It would be wrong, however, to only focus on the Muslim component of those events. Rather, if the Muslim component was significant, it was in no small measure because of its wider resonance on and confluence with the political left. It would unfortunately take far too long to properly analyze the changes that have reshaped the left in recent decades. What can be said is that the factors I mentioned above that have reduced our society's integrative ability and strengthened the centrifugal forces over the centripetal ones have also dramatically altered the left's outlook and complexion. Thus, as we move to an ever more fragmented society, the mass organizations that once characterized the left have been replaced by a proliferation of identity groups whose entire raison d'être lies in being different. All these groups have in common is that they are defined by opposition and that they perceive themselves as victims. What brings them together is not, as was the case with the left in the past, a shared project, much less shared hopes and aspirations. They have none. What they share is enemies. Their dominant mode of action is, to use a phrase coined by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, common enemy politics, with the adversary being all that they have in common. And the movement as a whole only retains and can only retain its unity and its momentum by constantly having an enemy against which to mobilize. This common enemy form of politics is inherently Manichaean. It divides the world into good and evil, children of darkness, children of light. It is, as a result, permeated by a sense that politics, instead of being the laborious, never-ending process of stitching together compromises and understandings, is a fight to the death in which everything is permitted. Its underlying emotion, which it uses to maintain its mobilizing potential, is that of the lynch gang, pure, unadulterated hatred. Many years ago, with the example of Nazism still fresh before her eyes, Anna Freud, Sigmund's daughter, reflected on the distinctive nature of hatred. A good lover, she wrote, is one who is faithful to his object. In contrast, the good hater is inherently promiscuous, dominated, indeed overwhelmed, by the free, surplus aggression at his disposal. He is ready to discharge it on any object. That is precisely what we have seen in this country over the last decade. The rise of the politics of hatred. The hatred is constant. What changes is its target. The sequence will be well known to you. The crusade against Cardinal Pell, the excesses of #MeToo, the rise of extreme climate activism, the pathological responses to the COVID pandemic, the vituperative rhetoric during the referendum, and now the demonization of Israel and the escalating attacks on Jews. To list them in that way is not to suggest that the targets are purely random or opportunistic. There is a deep logic in their selection. They are, albeit in different ways, symbols of everything the far left rejects. In the case of Jews, attachment to tradition, pride in achievement, commitment to excellence, fidelity to this country and its values, affection and admiration for Israel. All that makes for an easy target. Personally, I do not believe that the politics of hate will dissipate or even abate anytime soon. Nor do I think it will turn its attention elsewhere, leaving us alone. bringing together a broad base that stretches from significant parts of the Muslim community to the vast bulk of the quote-unquote progressive left, its impetus is now too great not to endure. And the underlying social forces that shape it, from fragmentation to the descent into tribalism, show no signs whatsoever of going into reverse. The question then is how we deal with the consequences. There is a great deal that could be said in that respect, but let me close by saying one thing alone. In the end, anti-Semitism is a moral failing, not an intellectual one. It arises not from ignorance of facts, but from the inability to recognize and value a common shared humanity. However, the flames of hatred, and especially those of anti-Semitism, are fanned by misinformation, bias, and outright lies. That, in my view, is why AIJAC's work in meticulously rebutting the proliferating falsehoods is so important, and why I am grateful to AIJAC and to all of you who are its supporters for everything you do and for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you very much.